The Blue Blood, a story by Slime Special 681, Chapter 7D. To understand the reconstituted Stygian corpse, one must first understand treason within the Imperium. Treason in the Imperium was subdivided into three categories: treason incompetent, low treason, and high treason. Treason incompetent was defined as treason committed unintentionally. It carried with it a penalty of jail time, military service, or exile. Often known as the drunkard's debacle, it applied to situations such as defacing a visage of the imperial family, breaking a governess's edict, often some form of curfew, or getting in a drunken brawl with a member of Her Majesty's military. More often than not, it was used as an excuse to draft young firebrands into the armed forces and set them straight. Low treason was defined as treason committed intentionally against the Imperium or its institutions. It carried with it the penalty of execution of any and all offending parties. At times known as the soldier's tie, it applied to situations such as fomenting rebellion against the local governess, spying for a foreign power, or desertion. High treason was defined as treason against the sitting monarch, any of their direct progenitors, and/or said monarch's children. It carried with it a blood purge of all the offender's blood relations aged 5 and up by 3 degrees. Great-grandparents, grandparents, parents, siblings, nieces and nephews, grandnieces and nephews, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. It had no other name, for even speaking of it outside a classroom was taboo. The Stygian corpse hailed from the heart world of Stygio 7. Situated on the current Imperium Consortium border, Stygios was initially colonized under the brief rule of the first emperor. Later, coming under hereditary Desari rule during the post-unification war reign of Emperor Creek. Over the next 2.5 centuries, the Desari House built the fringe outpost of barely 10,000 into a heart world of 9 billion. Yet, for all of House Desari's achievements, they could never fully stop the Consortium's slave raids. Nonetheless, as a direct possession of devout loyalists, Stygio 7 loyally served without fail until just over 5 years before the invasion of Earth. High Governess Margora Desari's only son had been recently kidnapped during a Consortium raid. As a result, she reached out to Empress Callista in desperation. In response, the Empress sent her second daughter at the head of an expeditionary force into Consortium space. A few days later, after concluding her pressing affairs, she herself arrived on Stygio 7 to deliver a series of speeches in a show of solidarity. Unfortunately, while she was in the middle of one such speech, this time to an assembly of 3 of the Stygian corps, the first, the second, and the third. The datanet suddenly lit up with the news that Princess Katria, instead of rescuing the Desari boy, had carried out an orbital bombardment on the Consortium Raider Enclave, killing them and all their prisoners. When news of this butchery reached the gathered Stygian corps, many of them broke ranks and rushed the stage. Seized by terror, the Empress immediately withdrew behind her golden glaives. The glaives, for their part, never missed a step, immediately closing ranks around the Empress and her husbands, rapidly ushering them off the stage into the safety of the armored royal shuttle, which was stationed just behind the main stage. In the confusion, and due to no standing orders regarding his safety, her youngest son, only 12 at the time, was left behind to the mercy of the mob. Dura made a name for himself on that stage that day. Abandoned and left for dead, he never shrank back or cowered in the face of the mutinous Marines. Instead, he disarmed and took down the first 8 that tried to seize him. Taken aback by a mere boy besting several Marines, the rest of the mutineers hesitated long enough for him to pick up the Empress's shirt mic from where she had dropped it and address them. After a heartfelt speech that left the young man's face blue, his chest heaving and his knees shaking, the officers regained control and the mutiny ended. When it came time for the treason trials 2 days later, the Empress set the young prince on a small silver throne next to her own immense golden one. This served the dual purpose of power projection and expressing that the young prince would be acting as her voice in this matter. Everyone in the Stygian corps and their families held bated breaths as Prince Duras brought forth the initial charges of treason. They all knew the recent mutiny qualified as high treason. They all knew what that meant. And thus it was that all of Stygio 7 held their breaths as Prince Duras read out the charges. While you have certainly acted treacherously in attempting to commit an act of assault against me, your actions were not without cause, nor were they premeditated. The whole affair was of a spur-of-the-moment nature and of a general incompetence that is not befitting of high treason. Or real even low treason, for that matter. As such, the 8 women who touched me are instead to be found guilty of treason incompetent. They shall be exiled to a border colony forthwith, where they are to live out the rest of their lives. That is all, and with that, this matter is concluded. To the people of Stygios, the outcome was as surprising as it was merciful. In response to the young prince's show of mercy, the 8 corpses of Stygios resigned their original standard of the red Taurox and replaced them with the second prince's royal standard of the blue Nemoran bat. Their families and all the people gave him the title Heart of Stygios. As a result of these events, the Stygian system and the soldiers hailing from there remained fiercely loyal to Prince Duras Turtaran. Lieutenant Colonel Tianu's eyes focused on the little red sentence tracking across her HUD and stayed focused on where it disappeared along the edge of her helmet's visor. She remained like that for a moment before she realized that she had just frozen up on a battlefield. With a quick shake of her head, she cleared away all but one of the myriad of thoughts emerging from what she just read. Champion Mikoto. Champion Mikoto. Reporting as ordered, ma'am. The woman replied after making her way to the lieutenant. At 8 feet tall and weighing in at 492 pounds of pure muscle, Mikoto Daikyu was an immense hulk of a Shivanti woman. Nicknamed the Can Opener for her habit of crushing armored Nikaru slave raiders to death in their suits for the fun of it, she was unquestionably a brute. That is why Tianu initially had no real response when she arrived, helmet in one hand, wiping away tears with the other. She found her words once more though, when her eyes came to rest upon the blue Nemoran bat on the massive woman's chest. Champion Mikoto, you are hereby given the honor of leading Alpha Team in their assault on the Capitol building. All other targets are to be seen as secondary. Show these primitive stiffs what happens when you make the Imperium bleed. It will be my pleasure, Mikoto said, wiping her eyes one last time before putting her helmet on and making her way to Alpha Team. Lieutenant Colonel Tianu, for her part, started to make her way to Beta Team, comprised of 4 companies, 500 women. Their first target would be the Pentagon. DeepMinder take anything in their way. The Continuity of Operations Plan was a federal contingency initiative intended to guarantee the continued function and overarching operations of the federal government in event of nuclear war or an event in which the capital was somehow lost. The plan involved retreating key military and political representatives to a series of 3 core bunker complexes, from which a coordinated war of attrition or response to another regime toppling crisis could be directed. Said locations were as follows: Raven Rock Mountain Complex, Pennsylvania, Underground Pentagon. Emergency Operations Centers for the United States Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps. Defense Threat Reduction Agency, Federal Department for Countering WMDs. Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center, Virginia. FEMA National Radio System. Directly connects most federal public safety agency and the US military with most of the states and allow presidential access to the National Emergency Alert System. Serves as a major relocation site for the highest level of civilian and military officials in case of a national disaster. Cheyenne Mountain Complex, Colorado. Currently a Space Force installation and defensive bunker housing several military units. Backup location for the North American Aerospace Defense Command and United States Northern Command headquarters in the event of a loss of Peterson Space Force Base. The 4 Warrenton Training Center stations, Virginia. Station A, an administrative training and residential compound. A training facility for the Department of State, the CIA Directorate of Intelligence, and the CIA Directorate of Support. Station B consists of several multi-story buildings concealed atop the heavily forested Viewtree Mountain. 2 data center facilities, underground bunkers that houses communications infrastructure, a communications laboratory, communications training, electronics testing, and equipment maintenance. It also serves to connect the other stations, DC, other critical facilities in the DC area, and the Tyson Corner Communications Tower, which itself allows for the communication between the eastern and western sides of the Appalachian Mountains in the event of nuclear war and the associated communications interference. Station C, a CIA number station which can transmit coded signals to US embassies overseas and intelligence agents in the field. Station D, a core regional relay facility of the Department of State's Diplomatic Telecommunications Service. A system of secure integrated networks that support US government departments and agencies operating from diplomatic missions and consultant facilities outside the United States. It's also the primary high-frequency receiver facility for the CIA Office of Communications and hosts a variety of satellite communication ground facilities. In the immediate aftermath of the Princess's ultimatum and the subsequent lead-up to the initial bombardment, the COOP was fully activated. Now, just 57 minutes after the initial bombardment, things were looking grim. Mount Weather had been overrun, and, with the exception of the president, its staff killed or captured. Raven Rock, having survived targeted bombardment, was currently under siege by Hellcam sappers using a mobile drilling platform. A pre-integration Hellcam machine originally intended for boring into a planet's mantle to facilitate the construction of geothermal power plants. The Warrenton stations were in the middle of a losing gunfight with the Shivanti regulars tasked with taking and co-opting said stations. Only the Cheyenne Mountain Complex was holding strong. Thus, it was there that Air Force One, having barely escaped Mount Weather, was heading. Donald's right arm had been broken when one of the invaders tried to seize him as he'd fled Mount Weather's capture. The Secret Service agents had tased his assailants after quickly realizing that sidearms were ineffective, a realization that had cost the lives of 5 good men. After that, they'd helped him and the First Lady flee to Air Force One, losing 7 more men and the First Lady as they did so. Donald looked at the nurse working on his broken arm. He was a young black man, with traces of gel on his forehead from where the sweat had carried it. It amused Donald that he'd been worried about cutting the POTUS shirt to treat his open radial fracture, as though it had been some great sin. It wasn't, and Donald had set him straight on that point. perhaps with a bit less strength than usual. He hadn't accepted painkillers because he needed a clear mind for what he was about to do. A military aide sat off to each side of the president. One had the nuclear football open to him, the other had the enemy's landing zones. Donald started to key in the first code. Then the right wing was gone. Then the left engine. The final transmission from Air Force One was a mayday as they crashed into the Blue Mountains and were engulfed in fire and steel. The Shivanti, it turns out, knew better than to let someone with the authority to authorize nuclear deployments remain in the field. They knew that if the president escaped, he'd be a massive threat to both the initial invasion and future occupation. Unable to successfully capture him, they opted to take him out. An event they recorded and transmitted back to the Stygian battalion in the capital. It was meant to ensure a quick succession of power to the vice president upon his presumed capture. Capitol Building, DC. The troops of Alpha Team had found the Capitol Building mostly abandoned. This was due in part to the fact that it was night, but it was primarily due to the fact that only half of Congress was present in the Capitol. The intention being to have the Vice President and the junior half of Congress remain in the Capitol and the Vice President and the senior half of Congress move to their co-op positions. This was meant to maximize the effectiveness of the government in the event of a peaceful solution being reached or a complete rejection of Earth's attempt to negotiate. Miyukto Daikyu and Alpha Team had forced their way into the building with no friendly casualties a few minutes ago. But none of these representatives had the power, individually or collectively lacking the numbers for a supermajority, to surrender the nation. To her frustration, this was seemingly by design, and some had even managed to flee into the wider city prior to her arrival. Yet, as a notice that the primary tribal commander-in-chief had fallen flashed across her HUD, the path to victory became clear to her.
Line them up in the seats. Key representatives furthest from me, non-vital staff closest. Then get ready with the video file.
Miyukto barked in trade shill, orders quickly carried out by her troops, leaving the bottom rows of congressional seats filled. She then switched on her translator.
Humans of the tribe of the United States, we wish you to contact your secondary chieftain.
The woman beyond her started playing footage from Mount Weather's capture and the fate of Air Force One behind her.
Your former chieftain, Donald John Trump, has fallen in battle. We wish to speak with your current chieftain, Michael Richard Pence.
This was true to a degree, as they now needed the current president in order to secure a quick surrender. Though the primary reason Miyukto needed them to contact the new president was because the Shivanti weren't exactly sure where he was. They needed to confirm his location and secure his capture before he had a chance to use his authority to authorize a nuclear strike. A fact that many in the captive audience seemed to surmise, as after 3 minutes none had moved to do so. This prompted a sigh from the large Shivanti, as this meant she'd have to use anti-slaver tactics on males.
If you don't do so willingly, then...
She motioned to the young man closest to her. 2 Shivanti dragged him down in front of her, forced him on his knees, and held his arms. Miyukto looked him in the eyes, her own hidden behind her visor, his terror evident as he shook slightly. He was a young man, apparently a member of security, and not hard on the eyes. A pity. Miyukto slowly bent down, taking care to telegraph her actions to the crowd. She gently caressed his face with her massive hands, slowly bringing them to each side of his head. Then she started to squeeze. It was not gentle. It was not quick. It was not quiet. And it was not clean. She would go through 15 more in this manner,
before the representatives broke and called their new chieftain.